In the Summoner's Rift game mode, your objective is to advance into the enemy base and destroy their Nexus. This structure right here is referred to as the Nexus, and if that runs out of HP, then the enemy team will lose the game. Now, there are a number of steps that have to be completed in order to reach the Nexus, and we'll talk about those now. One of those steps is to destroy the Nexus turrets. These two turrets that are standing next to the base. Turrets are very powerful structures in this game. They are buildings that if you enter their range as the enemy team, they will start to shoot at you. Each individual shot does a lot of damage, and that damage scales up the more shots you take. So you don't want to stay under these for very long, especially early on in the game when you haven't had time to build your character up. And even then, you only really want to be tanking them if you have a very particularly tanky character with a lot of HP, a lot of defenses. So these two turrets need to go down in order for any player to be able to attack the Nexus. That's not a practical consideration. That is hard-coded into the game. You cannot get to the Nexus and start attacking it until those turrets are down. In order to gain access to the Nexus turrets, there's another step you have to complete. You need to destroy any one of these three inhibitors. These inhibitors are protected by their own turret, and again, just like the Nexus turrets, the inhibitor turrets need to be destroyed before the inhibitor can be accessed and attacked at all. Inhibitors do not defend themselves, just like the Nexus, but with the inhibitor turret there, and undoubtedly with players who are likely to try and defend it, they are difficult structures to reach. Typically, the team that gets the first inhibitor down is the team that is most likely to win the game, because that's pretty deep into the enemy base, and if you're able to gain access to that sooner than the other team, that probably means you have pretty significant control of the map at that point. From the inhibitor turret, there are two more turrets that advance further out into the map for each of the three inhibitors. And these turrets and the paths that they mark are referred to as a lane. So these two turrets right here, combined with the two turrets on the enemy side, form what is referred to as the mid lane. These two turrets here and the corresponding ones form what is referred to as the top lane, and in case you couldn't guess, this down here is the bottom lane. One other significant factor of these lanes, besides the fact that they are marked by turrets and that they are largely open otherwise, there's no grass anywhere in the lanes themselves that players can hide in, is that every 30 seconds, the Nexus of each side will release minions. Minions are small, defeatable, non-playable characters. They advance in the direction that they have to go to get to the enemy base through their lane. They're a constant attacker on the enemy side. And given, normal play, they will meet in the middle with the enemy minions, and they will start to have a fight there. And this is one of the major cycles, the major clocks of the map. It is, where are the minions? How far forward are they? How well are they about to do in their battle? Normally, the minions will play relatively even, although small acts of random chance will cause one side to have slight advantages that will eventually snowball and lead to them, destroying turrets even by themselves. But that takes a pretty long time. Typically, the way that a minion wave is going to advance on the enemy minion wave is that it receives extra help. If the minions hit the enemy minions, but there is an enemy player who is positioned with those minions and helps attack the enemy minions, now this wave will be healthier than this wave, and this wave will go down, and this wave, the wave that won, will be able to move further forward. And this is the primary method by which players will advance to and attack the turrets. They don't want to tank the damage that the turrets are going to do themselves, so they will have the minions get in the way of the turret, and only then, once the minions are tanking the turret shots for them, will they attack the turrets and try to advance. In late game, you may have champions that are tanky enough that they are able to tank turret aggro and just blow through the turrets themselves, because often at that point, the characters that are designed to do damage will also damage the turrets very quickly and get rid of them before they can do very significant damage. But that is a pretty late game point, and very early on, that's going to result in a lot of players going down. That's not a way that you're going to play the game. Given these constraints, we have a series of different types of characters to work with. Now, one initial thought that you might have is, why not just put all of your characters into one lane and try to overwhelm the enemy team to get through that one lane as quickly as possible and gain the quickest possible access to the enemy base. The problem with that strategy is that even if you put all of your effort into destroying just the turrets in that lane, it's a very slow process. And while you're laboring away at chipping down this tower, while they put maybe 3 units in the middle to try and defend against your 5, using the turret to supplement their forces, in the meantime, they're going to put important damage-dealing characters in the other lanes, where they will be able to kill those minions, which give gold and experience to power up the characters. And during that time, these 2 characters are getting significantly more gold and experience for what they're doing than any of the 5 enemy characters that are in the middle, which are all sharing just 1 lane's worth of resources. Even within the middle lane, where these 3 players are besieged, as long as they can just stall out the other players, they also are getting stronger. Because while these players have to split all of the golden experience that's in this lane 5 ways, these players only have to split it 3 ways. So ultimately, given enough time, while you may lose this turret a little bit earlier, in the meantime, all 5 players on the other team are becoming stronger than all 5 players on this team. And so ultimately, when it comes down to a decisive fight, they will be able to win that fight. And that fight will come before this team is really able to get very far through this lane. Additionally, these players here do still have access to the win condition, because they have the ability to attack these turrets and advance further in their own lanes and take these turrets down. And if nobody in the team of 5 here decides to go and attend to that push, now the enemy team is going to reach the base. So it is considered necessary in the vast majority of strategies for players to have someone at least being a steward of each of the 3 different lanes. Each of the 3 lanes has its own source of golden experience that's very significant, that is enough to significantly improve the stats of whatever champion is there farming it. And so letting those resources go to waste and ultimately losing out on the ability to fight is not worth potentially pushing for a few early turrets before then being overpowered. So given that what we want is to put someone in each lane, the question then becomes who? And so in order to answer that question, we now need to talk about the different kinds of characters and how they're going to help in winning fights. Because while the goal of the game ultimately is destroying structures, and that is what the overall objective comes out to, the way of defending those structures is by fighting. And so fighting is, in a sense, part of the win condition. There are some rare cases, some exceptional situations, where it can be possible to win games without fighting. For example, there is a strategy called split pushing, which we kind of already talked about, which is where you have a character whose goal is just to push for towers on usually one of the long sides of the map, either the top or the bottom side. As you can see, the middle lane is shorter than the others because of its shape. So usually you'll put this on one of the long sides of the map and then put the rest of the team on the other side of the map to try and fight over something there. So for example, the other team, the rest of the team might go towards this direction and contest this major objective, the dragon, which we'll talk about in a minute. And while they're doing that and the other team is forced to respond to it, there is also this threat that this player in the meantime is going to be picking up a turret or two in the other side of the map. And the enemy team is forced to split their forces to go after this player if they want to stop that. If this player who's split pushing is ahead, if they are stronger than someone on the other team, then it may take disproportionate resources to respond to that, leaving this option open to the team of 4. If this player goes uncontested and the team of 4 over here is going to be overpowered, that's fine. They can back up because in exchange, they're getting whatever this player on the top side of the map is able to obtain. So that's a very common strategy, and that's something that you will see, pretty commonly. But for the most part, it still revolves around fighting, because the way that you get rid of this split pusher is by fighting. And if this split pusher is able to fight better than the members who are sent to get rid of them from that lane, then they may be able to either get rid of this player and keep split pushing, or they may simply need more players to devote to getting that player. And that again creates that strategic advantage that now the player on the top side can just back up and try to get away, while the players here can play at advantage. So again, it all basically comes down to how well you can fight the enemy team. And so let's talk about the way that fights go down in League of Legends. The first question is, how do you do the most damage? Because if you're doing more damage than the enemy team, chances are you're going to win that fight. There is a type of character that hyper specializes in damage output, and that is the AD carry. AD is an in-game stat. It stands for attack damage. And attack damage refers to the amount of damage that is done by the champion's basic attack, what you get by just right-clicking on someone. AD carries do a lot of damage very quickly to enemy characters by auto-attacking them. Now, these characters, in theory, do more damage than anybody else, and doing more damage should mean, that they are the ones that are most likely to win the team fight. And so they are something of a priority. But there are a couple of problems with that sort of thinking. For one thing, AD carries tend to have very low health pools. So even if you put 5 different players on the map that all are AD carries, if you get a character with a lot of damage mitigation that is able to tank a lot of damage in a fight and get on top of one of these things, it doesn't take a lot of damage to be able to get rid of it and remove its damage output entirely. So you can't just stock an entire team full of these. Another issue is that it doesn't have a lot of burst damage a lot of the time. While it does more damage per second, and if one of these is left unchecked, it will just shred an entire team faster than anything else in the game, an AP carry specializes more in burst damage, in being able to do a lot of damage in a short amount of time, but then having a cooldown on that damage that balances it against the AD carry's slow but steady playstyle. AP stands for ability power, and that generally refers to the stat controlling the damage on your Q, W, E, and R keys. Now, there are exceptions with a lot of different champions. Some champions' abilities scale with attack damage, and some champions even have ways that their auto attacks can scale with ability power, or do ability power damage on top of their attack damage. There's a lot of confusing exceptions, but in the general case, the easiest way to think about it is AP is going to control your Q, W, E, and R damage, and AD is going to control your auto attacks. Now, the AP carry, like we said, is a burst champion, and so their goal is to just 100 to 0 a single target a lot of the time, or maybe a group of enemies if they have AoE spells, as quickly as possible, and then back up to give them time for their cooldowns to come back up. And hopefully they have a disproportionate enough impact with those spells, with that one combo that they put out there, or with their sustained, throwing out a spell, waiting for it to come back up and throwing it again, that they're able to take an enemy character out faster than the AD carry can take out any one character. And in doing so, this AP carry can mitigate the damage output of this team. Because even if this character is doing more damage than anyone on this character's team can, if the AP carry removes them from play, now this character's team is way more disadvantaged in that fight. And since this character is relatively squishy, that is low health pool, low defenses, it is a very likely target for a character like an AP carry to go after if they get the opportunity. Burst damage is going to beat DPS in the 1v1 unless this character is able to do DPS while not being hit by the burst damage at all. So the AP carry has a little bit of an advantage there, and that makes both of these kinds of characters very important to have in team fights. One of the reasons that you call them carries is that they carry the team's damage output. They are the characters that are going to do the absolute most to actually remove enemy players from play. Anybody else around them is a utility character that's essentially there to try and support one of these unless they can get ahead and do significant damage themselves. But these are the characters that you're usually playing for trying to get strong, so that in especially late game situations when these have all of their items and scale up, they can do the absolutely massive damage that both of them are capable of and help you win those late game fights to get yourself into the enemy base. So let's talk about some of the characters that play around these and why they go where they go. So one consideration for where these players go where they go is that the lanes are different sizes. So the middle lane, the mid lane, is the shortest one, which also makes it the safest one. Because if you're out in the middle of your lane, which is where the minions are likely to be at any given time, the distance between you and the safety of your tower is shorter than it is if you're in, say, the top lane. In the top lane, you have to go significantly further back. And that extra distance can mean that if you've made a miscalculation and now you're needing to back up, you may not have the time to back up, and you may just be stuck taking that extra damage. So one of these two characters is generally going to be put in the middle lane because the middle lane keeps them the safest, and since they're one of the most important characters to become strong, that's generally who you're going to put there. That usually goes to the AP carry. The AP carry being strong is typically what a lot of teams are going to prioritize, and putting them there means that they're going to get the easiest farm in the game to obtain, and they're also going to have the safest lane. But they're going to go there by themselves. One of the reasons for that is that because it's the safest lane, they are going to be able to back up faster and they don't need the extra help to keep them alive. Another reason is that this way they don't have to share resources with anybody else while they're in their lane. Even if only one character in the lane is attacking the minions and actually getting the gold from them, if you're in the lane with someone else, you're sharing the experience that you gain from those minions, and so you're not going to level up as fast if you're in there with somebody else. So putting two players in mid lane has not been a strategy for a very long time, and so typically you're going to see just the AP carry going into the mid lane. The AD carry is typically going to go into the bottom lane. Now there are some strategies to try and lane swap. There was a whole season where the strategy was actually to put the AD carry on the top side, for reasons we'll discuss a little bit later. But typically you put them in the bottom lane. And in order to counteract the fact that that lane is a little bit less safe, you'll put them down there with a support character. This is the only lane in the game where you tend to put two characters there. And the reason for that is that This character right here is typically useless early on in the game. They do not do a lot of damage until they've had time to level up and get some items. Typically, they have very, very weak early game stats, and so that makes them an easy target if somebody wants to go into this lane and try to kill them for the gold that provides, and to put them further behind so that it takes them longer to become the team shredding machine that they will be in the late game. Any time that you can buy off of the AD carry becoming strong clock is time that you have to win the game before they can reach their win condition. And so that is often a way that you are able to mitigate the enemy team's damage. So since this character is such a target, you put them down here with somebody who's there to help them and basically just keep them safe. We can talk about the different kinds of support a little bit right now, because supports will do a number of different things. The one I've listed here is Soraka, who I have specified as a healing support. Soraka is a champion that keeps you alive in fights by giving you health back. And it's one of the best champions in the game at doing that particular thing. So while there's very little damage output on this character, it ends up being a major factor in being able to win fights ultimately if it can stay alive, because it's going to keep everybody else alive and doing damage for so much time that they're going to more than make up for the lack of damage that is on the support. Now, supports can play a number of other different roles and be impactful in protecting the AD carry in that way, and we'll talk about that once we've talked more about the other roles. But for the time being, just know that the support is down here to make sure that the AD carry stays alive and to make sure that the AD carry gets as strong as possible. The support's job is not to take kills, is not to kill minions, which gives the gold to you. It is to let the AD carry do those things, because the AD carry is the one that's going to carry the damage output of the team in the late game. And this support is just here to make sure that the AD carry is able to get to that point where they're going to be able to come strong. They're trying to funnel as much of the golden experience from this lane into this character as they possibly can. Now, the reason that you put two characters on the bottom side, you put the AD carry and the support on the bottom side, is that the dragon spawns on the bottom side for both teams. This is a neutral objective. There's only one of them. It's not symmetrical across the map. This is not another dragon. This is the only spot right here where there is a dragon. The dragon is a neutral monster that can be killed, and upon killing it, it grants the team that killed it a buff. And fighting over those buffs is a very important win condition. Now, originally when the game came out, the dragon was the only objective that was going to spawn in the relatively early game. Now there is the Rift Herald, which actually spawns on the top side, and so that changes the rationale a little bit. But originally, the rationale for the bot side being over here was that since there's a neutral objective on the bottom side that you can fight over, and not a neutral objective on the top side until 20 minutes into the game when Baron spawns, it's more important in the early game to have as many players as possible guarding the bottom side of the map so that you have access to better fights over that neutral objective. And so typically that's what would happen. There was a metagame in which you actually put the AD carry and the support on the side of the enemy team's top laner. We'll talk about the top laners in a second, but the top laner is a solo player, someone who just farms by themselves, and putting the two players against that one player gave this team of two more of an advantage and the free ability to farm up, and that was a strategy that was used, but it's not one that you see very much anymore because that became a very slow, boring play style. People didn't like watching it, and so League of Legends, Riot Games, tried to patch it out of the game. Now let's talk about some of the other supplemental roles, because the support is very intimately tied to the AD carry. The AP carry is solo in the mid lane, but that way they're a little bit safer and they're also able to get a little bit more farm. Then, on top of that, you have some characters that are there for damage mitigation. So, the simplest of these to talk about, although probably the rarer of the two, is the tank. The tank is a role whose job is to have a lot of health and a lot of defense, and to maybe do a little bit of something threatening in fights sometimes. So tanks often have very supportive, like utility-oriented attacking options. They might have a lot of crowd control, that is, abilities that stun an opponent or slow them down, just impede them in doing what it is they want to do. They might also just do enough damage that you have to worry about them because killing them isn't very easy, and in the time that they have to stay alive, they will be able to get on top of an AP carry or an AD carry and do significant enough damage to get rid of them. But typically these characters are playing for their health pool. Mundo, for example, has an ultimate ability that gives him a lot of health regen and makes him move faster, which is all just to make him very difficult to kill, very difficult to remove from play. Tanks are a character that wants to be up blocking the shots of the AP carry and the AD carry from getting rid of the rest of its team. If the tank goes down and none of the rest of its team does, the tank did its job very well, because the tank absorbed a lot of damage that could be spent removing more significant damage threats from play and absorbed all of it just by itself. If this tank has 4,000 HP and this AD carry only has 1,000 HP, then the amount of damage that it takes to get rid of the tank could have been spent getting rid of 4 of these guys. So it's definitely worth it for the tank to be the one drawing aggro as long as its team is doing damage at the same time. The tank wants to be the center of attention. It wants to be forcing the issue and initiating, especially on the characters on the enemy team that are a little bit more vulnerable, that are a little bit more squishy, as we say. Low health pool, low defenses. A variant of this is the Bruiser. The Bruiser sacrifices a bit in tank stats, in health and defenses, in exchange for being able to do a little bit more damage. It's not going to do anywhere near as much damage as an AP or AD carry, but it's going to do enough and have enough health in exchange that if it gets on top of an AP carry or an AD carry, a lot of the time it's going to be able to win that fight because it's tanky enough to withstand the DPS of the AD carry and has enough burst damage to take the AD carry down as long as the AD carry can't kite it back. A couple of things that tend to be the case about tanks and bruisers, although not necessarily, is that they are often melee range characters. They often have to get closer to the enemy player to be able to do something about them, which encourages them all the more to be up on the front lines trying to initiate fights, because they have to in order to get close enough to do any damage in the first place. By contrast, the AP carry and the AD carry are almost exclusively going to be ranged characters, and that means that they are better off positioning in the back lines, because on the back lines, they're still going to be able to do damage, and they're also going to be safer from the characters that are trying to get in and get on top of them in order to take them out of the fight before they can do significant damage. So typically when you talk about your team's frontline, you're talking about the beefier champions that are going to be going in and trying to start stuff. And when you talk about the team's backline, you're talking about the real damage threats that are trying to sit and snipe players from behind while not taking any damage themselves. And one of the major win conditions that this establishes in a fight is taking out one of the squishies. If you can get rid of one of these players, that removes so much damage threat from the fight that a lot of the time your backline character is going to be able to go in and do more damage at that point because there's less of a threat on them. The tanks are going to be able to go and focus down a different target now because one of the important ones is down, and they're more likely to survive now because that character is not wailing on them anymore. And that's often where something will break down, if one of those characters just gets taken out of play for nothing. A couple of variants of these different classes, because while these are sort of your basic archetypes, there are a few variants that are worth noting. Going back to the support class to start with, supports don't necessarily need to be healing supports. Healing is a role that is pretty exclusive to supports, but there are other types of champion that can flex to supporting and have kits that are designed for doing so. But they just play one of these roles in the bottom lane with the AD carry in those 2v2 fights. So it is possible to have a tank support or a bruiser support. Tank supports are pretty common. Things like Thresh, things like Braum, characters that provide utility but don't do an awful lot of damage and just soak up a lot of the damage that is done to them so that the AD carry is left being able to shoot their shots without having to worry about the damage of the enemy team because they know that their support is going to outlast whoever they are shooting at. And so they're going to be able to win clean fights that way. So Leona, Braum, good examples of those kinds of characters, very difficult to kill, and when they get on top of you and do some kind of crowd control or something, they're impeding you enough that they're making it difficult for you to just get on top of their AD carry and do a whole bunch of damage and remove them from the fight. You can also see AP carry supports. Their job in that case is more to do damage to the enemy team to keep them away from your AD carry. Characters like Lux or Brand, for example, will stand pretty far away but do magic damage to force the enemy team away from your AD carry or away from the farm that they're trying to get so that your AD carry can get stronger and eventually chip them down so that maybe the AD carry can get some kills eventually. So you'll see Lux, Morgana, Brand filling that sort of a role. Bruisers often tend not to go in the bot lane, but there are some characters that can. Set is just really, really good at a lot of things. And so having a bruiser in the bot lane means that you're trying to set up specifically to get kills. You're trying to take advantage of the fact that this character can just jump on an AD carry or a support a lot of the time, especially one of the squishier supports like the healing supports, and just make them die, and there's not a lot of counterplay to that if they get on top of you. And so they're trying to set up for ambushes and to go and try and just get those picks for the AD carry to grow stronger by killing their opponents. Now, talking about the AP carry, there are also a couple of variants of this. So to clear the screen really quickly, we have the Assassin. An Assassin is a character that is very, very focused on getting that 0 to 100 damage right now. They are more likely to be shorter ranged characters that are going to dive and are going to just try and zero someone out very quickly, Zed being an example. And then on the other end of the spectrum of AP mids, you have the Control Mage. The Control Mage is more trying to keep you from being able to move forward toward it. It's very defensive in its playstyle. One important aspect for a Control Mage is to be able to clear waves of minions very quickly, because if the minions that are marching up the lane here can never reach the enemy tower, then it's very rarely safe to actually go and try and attack that tower. And so a Control Mage will just keep on very reliably getting rid of those minions so that the enemy player cannot get in. And since they're playing not to take fights but to discourage the enemy player from getting on top of them, they're able to farm those minions very safely, get very strong, and protect their towers very effectively in that way. So Assassin is a much more aggressive playstyle. Control Mage is a much more defensive one. But a Control Mage that gets strong enough can, in that playstyle, just often delete people in a very similar way. They still do a lot of burst damage. It's just that they're going to do that burst damage from the back lines in a more deterrent kind of way. Whereas the Assassin is going to be trying to force the issue and run in and get on top of the squishy characters on the other team in order to do its damage. They're both burst damage, but they accomplish it in more aggressive or defensive ways depending on the character. Now, we haven't gotten around to actually talking about what roles go where past these three. And that's because at this point, it kind of depends. In the top lane, you're going to put one character. And typically that's going to be a tank or a bruiser. Occasionally you will get some assassins that'll go up there as well, but most of the time it's one of these two, and the reason for that is simply that this is the most vulnerable exposed lane in the game. You're very far away from a lot of people who are likely to want to help you. It's unlikely, that the AP carry is going to have too much of a reason to want to wander up here, because the character in this lane is likely to be a tank or bruiser, so it's going to be a little bit harder for this character to be able to take down. And if they go to the bottom lane, they have 2 targets to go down there and try and kill instead of just 1, and that can get them stronger than just going and trying to fight one of them. So you're less likely to get support from the AP carry, although it is definitely a thing that happens up here than you are anywhere else. You're also alone in one of the longer lanes. The AD carry, remember, has this support to protect them down here. The Bruiser is not going to have any such thing, and they have the longest lane to go through. So they're going to need to, outplay their opponent, basically, if they want to get an advantage here. And since they are at melee range, they have to go even further into the lane to be able to get that farm. So it's a little bit dangerous, and it's very isolated, and it's very much a lane for people who want to just outskill their opponents in 1v1s. You can put a tank in there, you can put a bruiser in there, just any champion that tends to be a decent duelist or can just survive long enough to farm a lot for itself. So you see tanks there, bruisers there, all sorts of different things. Finally, there's a 5th player, and right now you can see we've got a player in each of the lanes, but we don't want to double up as much as we possibly can. The support is, again, an exception here because the AD carry is exceptionally weak in the early game and needs that extra protection just so that they don't get focused and killed. But even then, the support is trying specifically not to get a lot of farm, not to get a lot of experience, and that's going to weaken them a bit as a champion. They need to be pretty not dependent on items to be able to function because they're not going to get those items as quickly as a lot of other characters in the game. If you were to have a second support, that character would be getting significantly weaker as time goes on because they're, again, sharing experience and losing all the gold to this player who's up here. And this player who's up here also doesn't really want to be sharing that experience. They've got the survivability to be up here by themselves. They want to farm all of that by themselves. The 5th player goes into the areas that are not lanes. See, what we haven't talked about so far is that these areas here have neutral monsters that either side is capable of killing that will give them experience and gold that does not come from the typical source of experience, which is the minions that come down the lanes. By farming that, what is called the jungler, because they are in the jungle, that is the areas in the middle between the lanes with a lot of trees, a lot of monsters. You kind of get the idea. It's not probably very ecologically correct, but the junglers are able to gain experience and gold and scale up to some degree, and the major advantage that it gives them doing it that way is that they're not seen. See, the towers give vision, and the minions give vision. They make it so that if you're in one of these lanes at this battle line fighting with the minions of the enemy team can see you, and so you're a lot easier to keep tabs on for the enemy team if you're using that source of gold and experience. The jungler, on the other hand, could be over here fighting this monster right here, or they could be over here fighting this monster right here. And unless you have seen where they went using a ward or by actually having someone go in there, you don't know exactly where they are a lot of the time, and it takes a bit of detective work using wards and using player positions and where players were recently to be able to figure out where you think that jungler is at any given point in time. Since that jungler is unknown, where it's unknown where they are, they could even be on the enemy team's side stealing their buffs if the enemy team isn't careful. They could show up from almost anywhere. And when they do, they try to create disadvantageous fights for enemy players that are in lane, the enemy laners. So let's say that you have a jungler who is right here, and the top lane is right here. If the jungler comes up here and attacks this player and cuts them off from being able to flee to their turret, that makes this very likely to result in a kill and put their top laner ahead in that lane. Because for all of the time that the top laner is alive and the enemy top laner isn't, they're getting golden experience, and they're being able to go back and buy items and come back to the lane without losing golden experience from minions getting pushed into their turrets. And so they're going to emerge significantly stronger after one of those fights, especially since they're also going to get gold from killing the enemy champion, which is going to make them stronger still. So the enemy champion is going to be denied the ability to get golden experience. They're going to give away a whole bunch of gold by dying, and they're going to come back into lane and just have fewer items or weaker items than the enemy player will have. And that can put this lane ahead, start this lane snowballing, make it so that this top laner is starting to become overwhelmingly powerful, and maybe they can split push later on, or maybe they can become a really important factor in team fights. So junglers are going to set up those fights called ganks, jumping people, just ambushing them from whatever angle they can figure out to try and set one of those lanes rolling ahead of the other and gain an advantage on whatever part of the map that is. That way, the team is taking all of these sources of golden experience, the ones that you get from the lanes, and the ones you get from the neutral monsters, and funneling those into the champions as efficiently as possible so that no one champion is getting so weak that they cannot function, except for, I suppose, the support. The support gets some items that enhance their ability to get gold, but they're also characters that are going to tend not to need to get that much farm to be impactful. And it is their utility that makes them powerful in team fights later, so losing out on them isn't necessarily going to be too bad of a thing for them in those later game team fights. So that's how all of the resources are divvied up among all of the different characters. What you're going to tend to see in building a team comp is you're going to want to see a mix of the different roles. So you don't want too many bruisers or tanks because then you're short on damage, but you don't want too many squishy characters because then it's too easy to mitigate the damage that your team is doing, and you don't have enough pressure on the enemy backline to be able to stop them from doing damage to you. Some amount of utility is very useful, utility being maybe healing support, maybe crowd control, that is stopping the enemy players from being able to do things. Maybe that is buffing the characters that are on your team. For example, a character Yuumi doesn't even have a health bar that you can access. They don't have you cannot do damage to them because they will attach to one of their own champions and make that champion kind of twice as strong. So there are a number of different things that you can do there with the support character. But it's also important to have a mix of AP and AD. And this is just for simple stat reasons. If an entire team consists of attack damage characters and nobody has ability power that's significant, the enemy team can build armor, which is the stat that counteracts attack damage directly. And by building armor, they're making themselves more resilient to every single character on your team. Whereas if you have a mix of AP and AD, they can build armor, and that will help them against the AD carry, but that's not going to help them against the AP carry, and vice versa. They could build magic resist to avoid the AP carry's damage, but the AD carry will then start to shred them even harder. And so having a mix of those two things forces the enemy team to itemize, especially the tanks and bruisers, to itemize a little bit more spread thin in order to be more survivable in those fights. So it's especially important to get both of these characters going, if at all possible, to be able to help do the most damage you possibly can in a team fight. The way that fight dynamics tend to play out is that, like we've mentioned, you will have your frontline characters that are going to be up trying to force the issue and initiate. Like we said, these characters often have crowd control abilities, that is, abilities that will keep the enemy team stuck there or disable them in ways that the backline characters can deal ranged damage to them and try to pick them off. If an enemy character tries to rush in and go after one of the squishies in the backline, it becomes the goal of that squishy to stay alive, if obviously doing damage if it possibly can while it's doing so, but surviving is more important because ultimately you're losing more potential damage by dying. And in the meantime, in order to get that character back online, in order to get them active again, the rest of the team is going to want to peel. That is, their job is to target this player right here in some way by maybe crowd controlling them or just killing them really quickly so that they get off of your squishy character and they are able to return to the fight and continue doing damage again. You don't want to spend all of your resources on peeling, but there typically does need to be a certain amount of that happening. And if you peel effectively, what can happen is if this player rushes too hard and you're able to kite back effectively and you're able to get players in their way, this player is kind of isolating themselves by diving too hard. If the rest of their team isn't able to follow them in there, if they're using movement abilities to try and get at that character, then you can kind of isolate this player into this 4v1 where they're only able to retaliate as one person and they're receiving 4 people's damage, and the rest of their team, if they're not able to get in there and help that player, they're not doing damage at this time, and so you end up doing more damage than they're doing at any one point in time, and that can be an advantageous fight. So it's important, for the initiators to be careful with their diving, because if they dive too deep and the enemy and the rest of their team can't follow them in, now the enemy team is at an advantage because they've removed a source of damage from play. They get this 5v4 scenario, and now they can start to pressure and open up the enemy team. Hopefully that helps you out in your games, and happy April Fools, everybody.